Breathe in the damp smell of human misery. A cramped cell, a gaunt prisoner. He huddles in the corner in his ragged clothing on top of a bed of straw, surrounded by scuttling rats. This haunting image of a medieval dungeon, it's one that's captivated our imagination in books and films for some time. But imagination is one thing, history is another. What exactly was the reality of life and death in a medieval English prison? From the early Middle Ages through the late 15th century, the English prison evolved from a rare makeshift holding pen into a grim institution of royal justice. Let's go back together today, and we'll speak of how prisoners lived and died, what they ate or didn't, how they were treated, and how the very notion of incarceration changed over time. And don't forget the damp cells and torture chambers, the corrupt jailers, the long-suffering inmates, and the broader justice system that consigned these people to their fate. It's a story of cruelty and despair, but also of order and reform, peppered with astonishing anecdotes of human endurance and ingenuity. Welcome to the channel. Well, it's good to be back for one of these more macabre topics. They seem to be quite popular. If you're new to the channel and you're still trying to figure out what's going on, well, nice to meet you. I invite you to hit the subscribe button if you've not yet done so, the like button too, and leave your thoughts down below in the comment. You wouldn't believe how good it is for the algorithm. Now, you will notice throughout the breadth of the video there are 0 ads. Not bad, Made possible, of course, by the generous contributions of those on YouTube memberships, Patreons, and the occasional cheeky donation. Thank you all very much. Surprisingly, the kindness of strangers is, well, it's quite abundant. Now, with all that being said, let's get nice and relaxed. Introductions out of the way. Let's go to jail. Well, we begin. The origins. In the early medieval period, the concept of long-term imprisonment as a punishment, well, it was largely unknown, at least in England. During Anglo-Saxon times, that is before the Norman conquest of 1066, there were essentially no dedicated prisons at all. Anglo-Saxon justice, well, it relied on fines, known as vergild or man price, or harsh corporal penalties like mutilation and execution. They weren't going to lock people away. Just get it over and done with. Off with a finger, something like that. That ought to teach them a lesson. If a crime was committed, the offender or their family usually paid compensation to the victim's family. For serious crimes such as treason or violent offenses, the response was swift and brutal, an execution or a physical punishment. But not imprisonment. The very idea of maintaining a prisoner at the community's expense, well, that ran quite against the practical customs at the time. A person found guilty would be punished or made to pay. They wouldn't lock them up. Waste of taxpayer money, I suppose. In fact, early medieval law codes and chronicles barely even mention jails, and records suggest the Anglo-Saxons had no professional jailers or prison buildings in the way that later centuries would. But when necessary, a suspected criminal might be temporarily detained in a lord's house or a church crypt until a trial could be arranged, or more commonly, they were bailed into the custody of kin. but the notion of a prison sentence, months or years behind bars, before the 12th century in England, it simply did not exist. All of this began to change after the 1066 Norman conquest. The Norman kings and barons brought new attitudes towards authority and fortification. They built great castles across England, and within these castles they created secure chambers and dungeons to hold those people deemed dangerous or important. In the 11th and early 12th centuries, imprisonment started to appear as a tool of political control. A rebellious noble or a high-ranking captive taken in might find himself thrown into a castle dungeon, not for a defined sentence, but as an open-ended detention at the whims of the king. For example, in the year 1100, the Tower of London received one of its first famous prisoners, Ranulph Flambard, the Bishop of Durham. Flambard had been a powerful minister to King William II. When King Henry I came to power, he accused Flambard of extortion and locked him away in the Tower. But this early incarceration did not last long. Flambard actually got out. How did he do it? Well, his plan was to get his captors drunk on wine, and then lowering himself from the tower with a smuggled rope. Clever idea. His escape became quite legendary, showing both the presence of these new Norman prisons and the fact that a clever prisoner with resources could still outwit his jailers. Nevertheless, by the early 1100s, the idea had taken root that castles could serve as prisons for the enemies of the realm. It was under King Henry II, reigning 1154 to 89, that a truly systematic network of prisons were established in England. Henry II's legal reforms revolutionized the English justice system. In 1166, through the Assays of Clarendon, the king ordered that those accused of serious crimes be held in custody, while royal judges travelled the circuits to try them. Crucially, this royal decree required that every county in England have a jail for detaining these suspects. If a county had no jail, the sheriff was now obliged to set one up, often by fitting out a room or cellar in an existing castle, or county sheriff's house as a holding cell. The crown even bore the expense of constructing jails where necessary, reflecting how important this system was to Henry to have his reforms and suspects secured. Within a few decades, permanent prisons, usually called jails or castle dungeons, existed in every county. By the early 13th century, nearly all English counties had an official jail in operation. These early jails were often just repurposed keeps or gatehouses. For instance, the City of London began using the old Newgate, one of the city gate's towers, as a prison by 1188, following the mandate by Henry II. Thus, by the High Middle Ages, imprisonment had evolved from a rarity into an integral part of the justice system, albeit, initially, as a means to hold the accused before trial, rather than as a punishment itself. Now, if I were to tell you that the daily life and the conditions inside these jails were actually surprisingly humane, you would accuse me of being a liar. And you would be correct. It is a lie, because they were far from humane in any definition. Life inside a medieval jail was characterized by filth, discomfort, and insecurity. Most jails were impoverished spaces in old buildings, castle dungeons, gatehouse towers, or cellars repurposed to confine human beings. Comfort was the last thing on the build plan. Conditions, of course, varied from place to place, but a few common features stand out. The typical prison was dark, often windowless, or with only a tiny barred opening admitting scant light. Cells could be stone rooms, with nothing but straw on the floor, or sometimes just deep pits or oubliettes, accessible only by a hatch in the ceiling. Of course, think about what they make castles out of. Dampness. That was pervasive. It didn't help that many dungeons lay below ground level, so water would seep in, and prisoners shivered in the cold, clammy air. Torches or lanterns were a luxury, seldom granted, leaving inmates in near perpetual darkness, save for any daylight that might slant its way in. The stench in such a place, well, that was pretty famous too. With primitive sanitation, prisoners often had to relieve themselves in buckets, and as if they had a bucket. Sometimes they just had a corner, and in crowded quarters, waste could overflow or go uncollected, fouling the air. One account from London noted that female prisoners at Newgate had to walk through the men's chamber to reach a privy, an indignity only remedied in 1406, when officials added a separate tower with a latrine for women. Overcrowding itself was a chronic problem. Multiple inmates were crammed together in spaces scarcely large enough, especially during times of social turmoil or when courts were not in session and the backlog of untried prisoners grew. In 1419, the situation at Newgate became so dire, with the building decaying and many prisoners dying from the close quarters, rampant disease, and terrible sanitation, that the city authorities had no choice but to temporarily shut the prison down. Only after the wealthy Lord Mayor Richard Whittington left funds in his will was Newgate rebuilt with slightly improved facilities a few years later. Certainly gives a sense of how appalling conditions could become before anyone really took action. And so within the prison walls, daily life followed no strict schedule beyond what necessity dictated. Prisoners passed the time in idleness, misery, and desperation. There were no organized work or rehabilitation programs. Concepts like that, well, they were a few hundred years away, that's for sure. Most inmates simply just waited for their trial, their sentence, their family to bring aid, or in the worst case for death to just bring some sort of release to them. Those who had money, they might be able to bribe the jailer for small comforts, like a little bit more straw on the mattress, a blanket, or even a little freedom of movement. Those without resources, which was the majority of people, languished on the bare stone floors, often shackled in heavy irons. Chains and fetters were commonly used to prevent escape and to punish. One late 15th century complaint by a prisoner recalled having, quote, great fetters and bolts of iron fastened on his legs, and being locked into wooden stocks in a deep pit. As for clothing, jailers did not typically provide that either, so inmates wore whatever they had upon their arrest until it fell to rags. In winter, the cold could be deadly for those without cloaks. Conversely, in the summer, the unventilated cells turned fetid and stifling. Infestations of lice, fleas, and rats were all just a part of the furniture of the place, I suppose. Prisoners often suffered constant bites from vermin, Indeed, the scurrying of rats across the floor and even sleeping over prisoners at night was a ubiquitous horror. Some inmates trapped and even tamed rats out of sheer loneliness, while others no doubt saw them as agents of terror, nibbling at their meager bread, or worse, their skin. But what about if you had friends in high places? Well, for those of higher social standing, conditions could be mitigated. Medieval prisons didn't have a uniform standard. A wealthy knight or noble held captive might actually be lodged in the jailer's own house, or in a castle apartment, rather than the common dungeon. And such a privileged prisoner could even have servants attend him. Decent food, decent wine, and even a bed. For example, during the 100 Years' War, noble captives like the French Prince Charles of Orleans, held in England as a prisoner of war for 25 years after 1415, actually had a pretty comfortable life, spending his time writing poetry and walking within the castle grounds. But don't be fooled. These were exceptions. The vast majority, common thieves, debtors, accused peasants, they experienced incarceration at its harshest form. Chained in a dark, crowded chamber, sleeping on straw soaked in filth, they lived day to day under the watch of jailers who might be brutal or indifferent, and their survival often depended on what charity they could obtain from the outside. In this oppressive environment, time lost its meaning. One medieval proverb grimly advised, "Go to friends for counsel, to women for pity, to church for pardon, to prison for experience." Experience, yeah, that's one word for it. The prison was certainly a world apart. Ordinary rules of comfort and hygiene ceased to apply, and only the strongest in body and spirit could hope to endure for long. And speaking of endure, what was the menu like? Nice little buffet in the morning, perhaps? Well, not quite. Food, or lack thereof, one of the most critical factors indeed in a prisoner's fate. You see, unlike modern prisons where authorities are obliged to provide meals, medieval jails typically did not guarantee any inmates sustenance at all. If a prisoner had money or friends on the outside, they might eat tolerably. But if not, they might just starve right there in the cell. Jailers were not funded by the government to feed any of their charges. Instead, they often made food a source of profit, selling provisions to prisoners or charging fees for allowing outside food to be delivered. In many prisons, there was effectively a pay-as-you-go system. Those who could pay the jailer or prison cook could buy better food, but maybe a little bit of meat, ale, or cheese. But the penniless, of course, survived on scraps or nothing at all. One chronicler in the 14th century described the plight of inmates calling out through their cell grates to passers-by, begging for scraps of bread. It was not uncommon for local townspeople or charitable church guilds to distribute alms, and especially around religious holidays, precisely because without charity, they knew that those souls locked down there in the dungeon would simply wither away. We even find bequests in medieval wills, leaving small sums, quote, "to the poor prisoners in such and such a jail, for food or fuel in the winter," indicating a community awareness that prisoners desperately needed outside help. Now, for those with absolutely zero support, the default ration might be nothing more than the proverbial bread and water, and often not even on that regular of a basis. The bread and water diets were sometimes explicitly imposed as a form of punishment. For example, errant monks might be sentenced by their abbots to a week on bread and water in a cell. In prisons, receiving only a coarse loaf of bread and a jug of water per day was essentially the lowest sustenance level to keep someone alive, and even that was not guaranteed unless some ordinance required it. And so starvation was sadly a real killer behind bars. Many inmates grew emaciated over long months of confinement. Diseases like scurvy could develop from malnutrition and lack of any fresh foods. A jailer's ledger from one medieval castle prison lists an expense for straw and bread for the prisoners, suggesting that at least in some places, minimal rations were given. But the quality, well, that would be pretty poor. You can imagine it. Dry, blackened barley bread, and water that might be foul or brackish. No warm meals, no fruits or vegetables. It was a diet that barely sustained life. Well, those who could afford it supplemented this meager fare. Family members might bring home cooked food to the prison gates. Some jailers allowed prisoners to send out for tavern meals at the prisoner's expense, plus a hefty bribe to the guard for favor. Prisoners of means might sometimes actually dine relatively well. Historical anecdotes tell of imprisoned nobles who feasted while captive. Renaud Flambard's famous escape from the Tower in 1101 was facilitated by a banquet of wine and meat that he hosted for his guards, a luxury repast for a prisoner. But such cases only show the vast divide between rich and poor. While Flambard could fill his cup with wine, countless unnamed debtors and thieves were lucky to swallow a crust of stale bread a day. In some instances, starvation was not just a byproduct of neglect, but a deliberate tactic of cruelty. One of the most horrifying events of the early 13th century was King John's treatment of Matilda de Braose, that is, Maud de Braose, also named, and her young son in 1210. This noblewoman and her child were held captive in a royal castle, tradition says Corfe Castle actually, as John's prisoners. John reportedly ordered that they be given nothing but a minimal daily ration, a small quantity of raw grain, and maybe a bit of raw bacon, and then no further food at all. After about 11 days locked in the dungeon, Matilda and her son were both found dead. According to a chronicler, the boy's corpse was discovered with the desperate mother's teeth marks on his cheeks, so maddened by hunger that she attempted to feed on her own child. A ghastly tale, that's for sure. It might be somewhat embellished, maybe not, but it still sent shockwaves through the nobility. I suppose the thing is, King John already had a reputation for, not being a nice person. People would willingly believe a story like that. Well, it was cited as one of King John's many tyrannies, and helped inspire provisions in the Magna Carta of 1215 that no free person shall be imprisoned or destroyed without due process of law. While it's an extreme example, it shows that starving prisoners into submission or death, it was indeed within the repertoire of the medieval rulers. Even on a less dramatic level, ordinary prisoners often wasted away slowly if they could not secure enough to eat. Chronic malnourishment made them vulnerable to disease and death long before any formal sentence was carried out. And guess what? Back then the court system was extremely slow. Sounds familiar, right? So you could be waiting for who knows how long. Thus, I think we can say that among the torments of medieval prison, that hunger was one of the most omnipresent and feared. To be a prisoner without friends or coin, well, that was in effect already a slow death sentence. Well, if it wasn't the hunger, it was probably going to be the disease that gets you. So let's talk about that, shall we? Cramped together in unhygienic conditions, and of course weakened by that poor diet, disease ran rampant. Medieval jails were breeding grounds for illness. In fact, they lent their name to one notorious sickness, jail fever, the term used for epidemic typhus that so often ravaged the prisons. Jail fever was spread by bodily lice, thriving on unwashed skin and clothing. In the squalor of a medieval dungeon, it could run rampant, killing prisoners by the score. Chroniclers and later commentators noted that in some years, the death toll in a prison from illness rivaled any executioner's tally. At Newgate, for instance, a report survives of 1 year in which 22 prisoners died from jail fever alone. And outbreaks like that were not isolated. All it took was one infected individual in the crowded, vermin-infested quarters, and a deadly epidemic would ensue behind bars. The symptoms, high fevers, rashes, delirium, would sweep through the jail, often affecting the jailer too, the turnkeys as well, and even visiting officials. Of course, medieval people, they didn't understand the precise cause, but they knew that prisons were unhealthy places. There are records of judges at county assize courts refusing to hold court inside a jail or delaying trials because the stench and sickness from the prisoners made it too dangerous or unpleasant to proceed. Beyond typhus, many other maladies flourished. Dysentery, also known as the flux, that was pretty common wherever people drank fouled water and lived in filth, causing uncontrollable diarrhea, and often dehydration and septicemia. Tuberculosis, too, also called consumption back in those days, could spread in the dank, sunless air. Skin diseases, ulcers, and infestations were virtually universal among long-term inmates. Malnutrition and scurvy meant wounds healed poorly, and gum disease was rampant. In winter, prisoners who were exposed to cold and damp might succumb to pneumonia or exposure. It was grimly observed that many who entered prison healthily would not emerge alive unless their stay was very short. For example, during the Black Death of 1348-49, plague likely tore through the prisons as ferociously as it did anywhere else. Contemporaries wrote that enclosed communities, like monasteries, suffered extremely high mortalities, and one can infer that prisons, likewise sealed off and overcrowded, saw a horrific rate of death. Indeed, some historians estimate that when plague struck, nearly everyone confined in a stricken town's jail would perish, as there was no escape from the pestilence once it infiltrated those prison walls. No special measures were taken to evacuate or protect prisons during the epidemics. They were essentially left to deal with it on their own. Now, in some towns, the sudden emptiness of the jail after the plague was actually one small consolation to the survivors outside. Death was a constant presence in the prisons. A significant proportion of prisoners died before their cases were ever resolved. When a prisoner died in custody, a coroner's inquest might be held, especially if there was foul play suspected. In theory, if a jailer's abuse or neglect led to death, he could be held liable for homicide. On occasion, juries did, indeed, indict prison officers for prisoners' deaths. There was one case from 1290 It tells of a Newgate jailer's servant who so brutally tortured a detainee, pressing him with heavy weights and even standing on his neck, that the prisoner died within 2 days. The subsequent inquest found the jailer's man guilty of murder, and he was actually hanged for it. It's a bit of a surprise, isn't it? But such accountability as this was very rare. But the fact that it happened at all shows that officials recognized extreme mistreatment leading to death as a crime. However, more often a prisoner's death was simply attributed to the will of God by a sickness. The bodies of dead prisoners were usually unceremoniously removed and buried in unhallowed ground if the families did not come and claim them. For the prisoners who remained alive, seeing their fellows carried out for burial would have been a pretty grim reminder of their own fragile odds of survival. Here's another cruel twist. Those who died under a pending felony charge were posthumously considered guilty, since they could not prove their innocence in trial, meaning that their goods, if they had any, were forfeited to the crown. And of course nothing was left for their families. The image of medieval prisoners routinely stretched on the rack or subjected to iron maidens is largely a creation of later imagination. Sorry to disappoint you. But in reality, torture in medieval English prisons, while it did exist, was not an everyday occurrence for the average inmate. English common law did not formally sanction torture to extract confessions in ordinary criminal cases. A point of pride, of course, repeated by legal scholars of the time. In the 1470s, Sir John Fortescue contrasted English law with that of France, noting with horror that on the continent, suspects might be racked with tortures till their sinews cracked and their veins burst, whereas in England, such methods were considered, frankly, to be barbaric. Nonetheless, there were certain situations in which extreme physical coercion was used in English custody, and the medieval prison certainly could be a site of torment. Maybe if you want to hear about real gruesome stuff, I'll do a video about the French medieval prisons. That could be interesting. Leave me a comment if you want that. Right, so continuing on, one context for legally sanctioned torture was the procedure known as the peine forte et dure, the strong and hard punishment, introduced in the late 13th century by statute in 1275. This was not torture to elicit a confession, but rather to coerce a defendant to submit to trial. If an accused felon refused to plead guilty or not guilty, perhaps hoping to avoid the verdict and protect their property from seizure, the court could order them put to the procedure. In practice, this meant the prisoner was chained in a low, dark chamber, fed nothing but little bread one day and stagnant water the next, and pressed beneath increasing weights. The idea was to break the person's will to insist on silence. Some yielded and agreed to stand trial. Others tragically died under the slow, crushing weight. This grim punishment was pretty rare, but it did claim victims. On paper, it was a form of legal torture, and it shows that the medieval justice system did have a mechanism to inflict extreme pain on the uncooperative. That case of the Newgate jailer's servant in 1290 who effectively murdered a prisoner by grave pressing penance may well have been an abuse of this very practice, taken to a lethal extreme. Beyond this, outright torture was sometimes employed especially for high-profile political prisoners or suspected conspirators against the crown. The Tower of London, as the state's fortress, was the usual setting for such interrogations. By the late medieval period, the tower had acquired devices like the rack, a notorious framework that could dislocate limbs by stretching. It earned the nickname the Duke of Exeter's daughter, after a constable of the tower, and although it became infamous in Tudor times, it likely made its first appearances in the 15th century, used sparingly on those accused of treason and other grave threats. Other implements included iron gauntlets or hanging shackles. Prisoners might be suspended by the wrists from the wall. The torture left no telltale scars, but caused excruciating pain and potential dislocation of the arms. And we do know that during the War of the Roses and the turmoil surrounding them, there were instances of captured agents being tortured for information, though the details of that are pretty scant. Understandably so. I'm sure they weren't publishing that in the daily newspaper. But there is one example outside the political realm. The torturers suspected witches or sorcerers. Extremely rare in England at the time. But there are hints that in exceptional cases, authorities did not shy away from applying the rack or other torments to extract information about supposed conspiracies involving magic. Of course, a few weeks ago I did do a video specifically about the English witch hunts. I've also done one about the German witch hunts and, of course, the Salem trials of later times. If you want a little bit more detail about it, well, perhaps that's your next stop. Now, moving on. Imprisonment itself, of course, was often punishment enough. When additional torment was desired, it could be ingeniously inflicted by the very design of the prison. This is where it gets interesting. Now, case in point is the Tower of London's tiny dungeon cell, known as Little Ease. They always give them such cute names, don't they? Built within the bowels of the White Tower, Little Ease measured only about 4 feet square by 4 feet high, so small that a prisoner could neither stand upright, lie flat, nor fully sit down. Being confined in this lightless hole for days at a time was itself a form of torture by discomfort and sensory deprivation. Though documented instances of its use come from the 16th century, Catholic recusants like Edmund Campion were said to have been kept there. The cell existed by the late medieval era, and it represents the psychological torture that architecture alone could inflict. Even without formal instruments, jailers had these cruel options. They could throw a prisoner into a horrible pit, that oubliette, literally forgotten hole, or deliberately deny sleep and warmth as unofficial torments. It's also important to note that while torture occurred, it was not applied arbitrarily to petty offenders. Most common prisoners, thieves, debtors, brawlers, they weren't worth the trouble of torture. They suffered enough through neglect, not active torment. Active torture, that was reserved for those considered enemies of the state, or those who refused to play by the judicial rules. And when it did happen, it was kept behind closed doors. No medieval English jury could convict somebody solely on evidence from tortured confession, unlike in inquisitorial continental courts, which meant torture's role in English law was quite limited and unofficial. But still, the possibility of facing the rack or other horrors loomed in the medieval imagination. The very threat could be quite effective. We have records of prisoners who, upon merely seeing the implements of torture laid out, immediately gave up whatever secret they had, or at least told the jailers what they thought they wanted to hear. In that sense, the dungeon's menace was as potent as its reality. For the unfortunate few who did feel its bite. The prison became literally a hell on earth, a place of screams in the dark and agony mixed in with the despair. Well, let's keep going. We're going to talk a little bit about the role of the jailers and a bit of corruption, bribery, all that good stuff. The prisons were not only places of misery, but also rampant corruption. Jailers and sheriffs wielded enormous power over the fate of those in their custody, and many didn't hesitate to exploit it for their own personal gain. In an era without standardized prison administration, each jailer essentially ran their jail as a private enterprise, making the rules as they went along, and often purchasing the post from the crown or a local lord and then extracting income from the prisoners. This led to a system of fees and bribes that touched every aspect of a prison's life. Upon arrival, the new prisoner might immediately be expected to pay a fee, simply to be admitted and unshackled. A practice so common, it had a name: the garnish, or entrance fee. And you better pay it, because without doing so, you'll be thrown into the worst cell, laden with the heaviest irons, or denied any basic needs. Those who did pay, they might secure a cleaner cell, lighter chains, or even occasional leave to walk outside, under guard, of course. In effect, money could buy survival and a modicum of comfort, while poverty had condemned you to the lowest circle of prison hell. Extortion by jail officials was often flagrant. They charged for everything: a bundle of straw to serve as a bed, a candle for light, a scrap of additional food, the removal of irons, or even messages delivered to the family. There are accounts of jailers who presented prisoners with regular bills to be paid, failing which the prisoner would be chained in a nasty dungeon, or even tortured. Debtors, people imprisoned for owing money, were especially vulnerable, creating a darkly ironic situation. They were jailed for their debts, and then forced to incur more debt inside the jail just to stay alive. Medieval city governments occasionally tried to curb such abuses. In London and other towns, ordinances were passed to set official prison fees. For example, so many pence per day for basic board, or a fixed fee for iron removal, in hopes of preventing outrageous price gouging. But enforcement was pretty lax, too hard to control, and many jailers ignored the rules. After all, what recourse did the prisoner have? If they complained, the jailer could retaliate with even worse treatment. Some prisoners did petition higher authorities for relief. The Court of King's Bench, or even the Chancellor in Chancery, might hear grievances from inmates who alleged they were being unlawfully extorted or abused. One such petition from the late 15th century by a cleric named William Haming reveals the horror of what corrupt officials could do. Hemming was falsely accused by a local sheriff's deputy, who then kept him in a dreadful pit, weighed with heavy irons and deprived him of food and drink, all to force Hemming to pay a hefty £10 fine to regain his freedom. Even after extorting the sum, the sheriffs made Hemming swear not to sue them under threat of violence. Such cases, they laid bare a system where the lines between lawful punishment and outright criminality by jailers were blurred, and the fact that Hemming eventually could appeal to the Lord Chancellor shows that there were theoretical checks on abuse. On paper. But practically, justice for prisoners was very rare. The corruption extended even to matters of life and death. For the right price, a jailer might even allow a prisoner to escape There are stories of guards turning a blind eye or even actively helping affluent captives flee in exchange for bribes. The dramatic escape of Roger Mortimer from the Tower of London in 1323, for instance, is believed to have been enabled by sympathetic insiders, whether through loyalty or coin. Likewise, some jailers sold pardons or arranged for charges to be dropped if they were well connected, essentially playing power broker. Clearly, a well-placed bribe could accomplish what legal appeals could not. At the same time, a prisoner without means might find every gate closed. Even when medieval knights occasionally proclaimed amnesties or released prisoners during coronations or at Easter, one had to pay the jailer a fee to actually get out. The jailer's control was such that an old saying went, "The keys of the prison are made of gold," meaning money was the key to freedom. Now, this all sounds pretty bad for the prisoners, but I have to say, if you really want to get on your grind, being a jailer might be a pretty good way to get ahead financially. It's the top one side hustle of 1312. Anyway, jokes aside, not all jailers were villains out of a storybook, of course. Some performed their duties within the accepted norms of the day without egregious cruelty. A few even showed mercy, allowing poor prisoners to beg at the gate for alms or not enforcing fees on those who were truly destitute. But the structure of the system, the entire game of jails, it incentivized abuse. Jailers had to support the prison and themselves, and since many were unpaid except through prisoner fees, extortion became the norm. In the late medieval consciousness, the jailer was often viewed as a sinister figure, greedily profiting from misery. Literature and popular stories depict corrupt sheriffs locking people up unjustly and taking bribes to get them out. The Robin Hood ballads, for example, include rescue of comrades from the sheriff's prison, tapping into the common folk's resentment for tyrannical officials. Is there any other kind of official? Well, the prevalence of corruption in medieval prisons shows that for many inmates, justice did not continue once the cell door clanged shut. Instead, they entered a shadow economy, governed by the whims and greed of their overseers. It is often said that in medieval England, prisons were not so much a punishment as a holding pattern. And that's largely true. The primary function of jails during the Middle Ages was to detain the accused until they could be tried, or to hold convicts for a short time before another punishment was carried out. Let's take a thief, for example. He might languish in a prison for months, awaiting the visit of the traveling justices who would judge his case. If he was found guilty, they might hang him. The prison was just the grim waiting room for the gallows. Similarly, a debtor would be locked up until his family paid his debts or he died trying, using incarceration as leverage rather than as a sentence itself. Long-term imprisonment as a sentence was quite rare. Public, corporal punishments were favored. Flogging, the stocks, the pillory, branding, banishment, or execution. However, by the late medieval period, we do start to see, imprisonment creeping in as part of some judgments, especially in towns. Think of a dishonest tradesman or a nighttime mischief maker being ordered to spend a few weeks in jail as punishment. And that reflects a slight shift in attitudes. Still, for most of the medieval era, to be in prison usually meant you were awaiting your trial, or awaiting ransom if you were a hostage or a prisoner of war, or just awaiting some outcome, like a payment of a fine or a royal decision on your fate. Thus, the medieval prisons occupied an uncertain place in the justice system. No one was really sure what they actually were yet. No one had realized what prisons would become. They were absolutely necessary for securing suspects and certain offenders, but not endowed with the moral purpose or bureaucratic oversight that later ages would demand. Simply tools of royal and civic power. The castle dungeon symbolized the lord's ability to crush opposition, and the county jail symbolized the crown's law reaching into every shire. Yet, there were also ad hoc and neglected institutions. Few resources were invested in making them humane or efficient. Prisoners were expected to fend for themselves, and if they suffered or died, well, that was just considered part of the inherent harshness of justice. Only occasionally did humanitarian concerns peek through, as when reform-minded mayors or sheriffs might allow a little better upkeep, or when the church intervened against a more egregious set of cruelties. The church did actually run its own ecclesiastical prisons as well. Convicted clergy or heretics could be confined in monastery cells. Notably, some Lollard heretics in the early 15th century were imprisoned under church authority, and usually with somewhat better conditions than lay jails. But it still wasn't a very nice place to be. The right of sanctuary also provided an interesting counterpoint. A fugitive who reached the sanctuary of a church could avoid the king's prison, at least for a time, showing that imprisonment was feared enough that desperate people would cling to altars to escape it. By the end of the medieval period, the institution of the prison was firmly entrenched in English society, dreaded by all, yet accepted as a basic element of justice. The medieval prison was a place of contradiction. It upheld the law by containing the lawless. Yet inside its walls, lawlessness and suffering often prevailed. It was meant to keep people safe from criminals, yet it provided no safety to those within. Looking back with a more modern perspective, we can certainly see how the medieval jail was a prelude to later reforms. Those horrors endured by the prisoners in these centuries eventually gave rise to calls for mercy and change, though true prison reform would not come until much later. The 18th and 19th centuries, figures like John Howard shining a light on conditions. In any case, the medieval period built the foundation. It established the prison as an instrument of justice, brutal and flawed, but indispensable. The tales of torture, disease, starvation, and corruption that we've explored today, they also serve to remind us of how far the concept of criminal justice has evolved since then. Yet, in some ways, the medieval prison experience has never entirely left. The very word, dungeon, it still evokes darkness, fear, and oppression. These were the realities of life in the medieval English prison. Hope was scarce, suffering was common. The strong arm of justice was often indistinguishable from the cruelty of captivity. It's certainly one chapter of history that once you've learned about, you won't easily forget. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. Did you have fun? If that's one way to put it. Certainly interesting. Of course, give ourselves another 100, 200 years, and we'll be looking back upon prisons in today's world. We'll probably be viewing them as quite barbaric as well. Let's not get too far ahead of us and call ourselves 100% civilized just yet. We still have a long way to go. Well, let's have a look at the patrons, huh? Both on YouTube and hang on, let me open the thing. Hang on. There we go. Okay. All right. Patrons and supporters on Patreon and YouTube. Thank you. Let's go. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitimus, Gary, Charlene, Linda Reese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfidnir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Dalbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Vanita, and Claire. Well, thank you very much, everyone. We had a good time together. So how about I see you in the next video? You can learn something again. Whatever, it's up to you. Good night, everyone. Oh, and as always, don't forget, lots of love to you all. Be good to each other. And don't go committing any crimes. Bye-bye for now.